the colleagues and the friends and the loved ones do wish that the author of this work could be with us here tonight. But sadly, that is not the case, at least not physically. But in spirit, well, we have his writer's voice. We have the sound of a great thinker and a great author. And there's a cluster of us. Well, it can't be a cluster if we're scattered, can it? But there's a bunch of people here tonight who are going to ensure that Phil's writer's voice comes through loud and clear in this evening's proceedings. Between us, I think we roughly represent the successive generations who worked with Phil and lived with his work for so much more than half a century. And what each of us is going to do is to read a short extract from this collection, second collection of retrospective essays, and just say a little something about how that essay and that extract speaks to or reminds us of the work that we may have done with Phil alongside him, or indeed the way in which his ideas have worked us over and prompted us in many instances to rethink some of our assumptions. I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to introduce the various contributors. I think that would be overstepping the mark. So each person as they come up will introduce themselves and, as I say, read from the book and talk a little bit about how that connects with the work they did with Phil. But I would just add this little note that the first person to come up to the mic, who incidentally is called Mike, will start off by saying something about this marvellous, bright, shining image which he commissioned specially. But Mike will tell us more about just how special that is. Would you like to come up, Mike?
Hi everybody. I guess this is about as close as I'll get to stand up. Don't worry, I'm not going to make anyone laugh. I knew Phil for about 10 years, I suppose, in various work we did together for the Living Maps Network, and I'll talk a bit about that in a minute. But this is an image an artist called Emma McNally made for me with some money that Phil left me after he passed. And sadly Emma couldn't make it here tonight, but she was happy to have this projected as the backdrop for the image. Emma's work is, I guess, large in scope and in sort of its conceptual scale as well. And usually these images are the size of the entire wall, and she had to especially kind of downsize one for me. So hopefully it represents a little bit about Phil's, I'd say, scattered mind, but also interesting and inspiring mind too. And hopefully we can kind of get into some of that this evening. Okay, so I'm going to read, so just bear with me. So I'm going to read from, well, two excerpts from a chapter called Skin in the Game, which comes in the first part of the book, and then I'll offer a response to that before I offer a third excerpt to finish. One of the commonest refrains amongst academics is that they can never get enough work done when they go to work. In other words, they are so busy and stressed out by ever-increasing teaching and admin loads, they literally have no time or place to think, let alone to do anything approximating sustained research. That is saved up for, in quotes, the sabbatical. The sabbatical became the holy grail of academic life, the promised land where all the ideas that have laid dormant will come to fruition. All the scattered fragments of writing will be brought together into a coherent whole, and the sabbatee will return to the academic treadmill, refreshed and with a renewed sense of intellectual purpose. The reality is somewhat different. The original meaning of the sabbatical, from the Hebrew sabbat, entailed the principle that 1 year in 7 the field lies fallow, so that it may be more productive on the 8th. And indeed, the notion of any latency period in the gestation of ideas is one that is strongly endorsed by research into the nature of creativity. However, the groves of academia have long ago been cut down to make way for the multi-sided, potentially 24/7 campus. These days, sabbaticals are definitely not about lying fallow. They are part of the publish or perish ethos which has come to dominate so much of our intellectual life. So we have a university research culture held together by the desire to get the hell out of the university into some kind of privatised sanctuary where there is, at last, some space and time to think. Yet once people get there, they often promptly collapse into lethargy or ill health, bodies and minds so addicted to the chronic stress of academic life that they simply cannot cope with its sudden absence. Okay, so that's the first excerpt, and here's the second. Within the arts, humanities and social science departments, political frustrations are sublimated in a rhetoric of pseudo-radicalism informed by the jargon of post-structuralism and to varying degrees linked to sometimes progressive, sometimes toxic forms of identity politics. This mix has recently been supplemented and re-energised by a focus on environmentalism and the more than human world. Despite its gestural rhetorics of radicalism, most of this discourse slavishly conforms to ever more elaborate protocols of academic scholarship, often fetishised to the point where every statement has to be authorised by the differential citation of work by members of the professoriate, to whose ranks these students will aspire and whose patronage may be decisive if they are to ever reach the once promised land of tenured status. The result is a research culture which superficially challenging the corporate structures of global knowledge economy, but deeply implicated in the survival of its academic foundations, thus making the erstwhile dissenting academy a perfect target for populist attack. Okay, and here's my response to Phil. Phil's words are like a thorn in my side as I start my first ever sabbatical this month. They won't be fatal, but they will act as a constant reminder of what it is that I think I'm doing in my job as a lecturer in an institution which seems to pride itself on research, despite running me into the ground with administrative duties that I thought AI was supposed to solve. I'm left thinking, which is of course his intention, of what the point of this work is and why am I doing it. Phil is not the first to question the role of the university today. We're all aware, especially in this room, of the debates regarding the value of education today. But the personal connection I had with Phil is what makes this provocation a particularly penetrating one. It sits there in my mind and demands to be reckoned with while I just want it to go away. At first, when reading Skin in the Game, you'll get the sense that Phil lost hope in the academic project, and especially the social and cultural fields of the humanities and their postmodern theories. The social and political drifts of the past 2 decades or more have killed off the kind of thinking and action that Phil thought we should be doing. And he's right when he accuses us of producing knowledge in the university that is more about impression management than it is about creating knowledge that can achieve material changes for the things and the people in this world that matter. Nevertheless, it's hard to opt out of the cultures of metrics if you want to pay the bills, and change is always easier said than done. Phil. In this essay, no clear solutions to the problem are raised, and this is classic Phil, I thought, putting ideas on the table only to walk over to another table and leave you to make sense of it. But he does at least point us in one direction which rings most loudly in his discussion about the history of scholarship, noting that the best of them, quote, take lines of thought for a walk or a song and a dance wherever they happen to be. More than that though, Phil was a keen believer in putting thought into practice, to not just write books about books. Drawing from Serres, he states, we need to return to the original Greek meaning of the word pedagogy, in a way that makes teaching and research into a single, indissoluble intellectual project. In the original Greek meaning of the term pedagogue, is one who does the school run, who not only takes the students to and from the place of instruction, but who makes the journey itself into an educational experience. End quote. So it will be no surprise to anyone here that Phil thought knowledge and ideas were not to be housed in the ivory tower, but rather should emerge from and with the world on its most contradictory plane, that of everyday life as it happens, usually in the street. What I take from this essay, perhaps his spikiest or sassiest of the collection, is his driving commitment to do so. This is especially the case through his work with the Living Maps Network, which I am part of along with Gina and Barbara and Toby. And I'm pleased to say that although not perfect and inevitably bound up in the mess of the university system, we retain a disregard for academic theory without application and remain committed to building knowledge at the level of the streets with the people that inhabit it. We should despair for the future of where thinking used to happen, especially now as the university sector is hemorrhaging swathes of good people. I read a stat of 10,000 jobs lost last year. But Phil's essay is a call to arms, and we should fight for it. But we should also keep in mind how such calls are then folded back into the problem he describes, where we speak with radical intent only to leave radical action to those more willing to grab the levers of power. It is in the doing that Phil was so fond of that thinking really comes to matter. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. So sorry. I've got a classic hamburger and pork bao buns. Is anyone waiting on either of those? Pork bao buns? Oh yeah, so one of those and a classic hamburger. Classic hamburger, anyone? No worries. Sorry about that.
No worries. I might want one. Hello everyone, my name is Gina, and thank you Jean for giving me a chance to participate in Phil's memorial book launch. Many of you will know, but I've lived in a few different places since I was little. The States, New Zealand, Australia. I was born in South Korea and now here in the UK. So when I read the Stuart Hall on both sides of the line and new ethnicities, the last chapter of this book, I didn't feel abstract to me. I felt very familiar, not in the sense of being caught between cultures, but in the sense of constantly having to reposition myself. Actually, Phil and I often had conversations about Hall. Phil was one of my distinctive friends with whom I could dig into complex theoretical topics while just enjoying sandwiches in the park. For Hall, living on both sides of the line isn't a problem to be solved. It's a way of knowing. It's about being able to live with difference without falling back on ideas of purity, origin, or a single stable identity. He uses this idea to talk about what he calls new ethnicities. Ethnicity here isn't fixed or inherited in a simple way. It's made through history, through contact, through movement. But, and this is important, the text also keeps reminding us that this kind of flexibility isn't evenly available. Some people are protected when they move between worlds, others are exposed. I'll just read a short section from the book. Living on both sides of the line is also, of course, what new ethnicities are supposed to be all about. The capacity to switch codes, negotiate multiple identities, feel at home in difference, and most definitely not feel torn between two cultures or conflicting value systems. Now, one of the problems with this model of identity work is that in some hands it tends to set up a binary opposition in styles of identity work between healthy, happy, hybridity at one normative pole and pathological purity at the other. in a way which fails to grasp the lived complexities of race, class, and gender in contemporary Britain. Secondly, it conjures up the exemplary figure of nomadic subject in a way which conflates the privileged cosmopolitan style life of multicultural omnivores and globetrotters with the denizens of gig economy, who from economic necessity, yes, have to encourage in a just-in-time production of the self, and also with the situation of diasporic peoples who have been forcibly uprooted from their homelands as a result of famine, war, or persecution. The precarious circumstances of such groups simply do not admit the luxury of living on both sides of the line, where the line in question is that drawn between survival or extinction. So sometimes hybridity opens doors, sometimes it just means you're never fully inside any of them. And sometimes it only works if you already have the right kind of protection, like education, language, institutional backing. This is where the article's idea of bridging and bonding capital becomes useful. Bridging lets you move, bonding lets you feel secure, and not everyone gets both. Another thing that text does, very quietly but very powerfully, is remind us that racism isn't just about policy or ideology. It's also about fantasy, and about how bodies are held in other people's minds. Moving didn't free my body from those projections, it multiplied them. Different places, different assumptions, sometimes subtle, sometimes not. That shaped how I think about my research. I'm less interested in fixing identity and more interested in how people lived with ambiguity, how they navigate being misread or partially recognized or constantly repositioned. This is where my work with mapping and drawing comes in. I'm an artist, and Phil helped me fill the gap as an ethnographer and how to link these two with mapping practice. I don't use mapping to pin things down. I use it to hold contradictions in place, to let people trace movements, attachments, losses, without having to resolve them into a clean story. In that sense, mapping becomes a way of working with what Hall calls new ethnicities, not as identities you arrive at, but as processes you keep negotiating. Living on both sides of the line today feels more fragile than it did in Hall's movement. Borders are harder, mobility is more uneven, hybridity doesn't automatically read as progressive. Because this article concludes Phil's final book, it also reads, at least to me, as something very personal. Many of the issues he raises here were things we talked about over lunches, long before they took this form. There were times I found myself turning the argument back onto myself when Hall talks about the privileged cosmopolitan, the multicultural omnivore. I recognize something uncomfortable here. I've had access to mobility, to institutions, to languages that allow me to pass in certain spaces. And that makes me ask a question. If I can move like this, if I benefit from these forms of privilege, am I still the right person to research minorities? Phil always used to say, stay with that discomfort. encouraged me with my research and to let it shape how I listen, how I frame, and how I make space for others to speak. Phil was genuine living map. Whenever we explored the city, he would traverse every narrow street that I would never have considered entering, continuously sharing his timeless yet live stories. I first met Phil in 2013, shortly after my marriage and the start of my PhD studies. I had a brief interview at Phil's London flat with John, and when the Living Map Network was established. Phil left us just after I completed my PhD last Christmas. So Phil literally started my PhD research together and ended together. Phil played a significant role in my research from beginning to end, and his influence extended beyond academia as he witnessed my family grow. Now I have 2 daughters, one aged 11 and another 6, who particularly miss having their grandparents nearby. They affectionately referred Phil as 영국 할아버지, meaning British grandpa. Lily is currently attending St. Paul's Girls' School, and he promised Lily to visit St. Paul's Boys' School during the joint concert between the boys and girls, as he wanted to see how his former school has transformed with the new location in Barnes. However, it seems unlikely that this will happen. This last Christmas was the first time my girls did not receive Phil's Christmas card and the jolly fun gifts he would thoughtfully prepare for them. I'll finish here, otherwise I'll miss him too much. Thank you.
Right, so evening everyone. So, I first met Phil when I just finished my PhD at Royal Holloway, and I kind of got, I don't know how Phil found me, but at the time I was making a memoryscape, as I called them, an audio trail along the River Thames, where you'd hear kind of memories of old dockers and people that lived near the river talking as you walked, and he was very struck by this idea and invited me to come to the Royal Docks, an area which I'd never been to in my life. And we went on a walk. And that walk led to, well, really a whole academic career. I didn't know it at the time, but that would be the start of getting on for 9 years working at the University of East London. And he got me my first job, my first proper academic job. And so I owe him a huge debt. And I picked an excerpt here which I think speaks to me and probably many of you who might have known the Royal Docks or worked near it or walked around it with Phil. And I think it just gives us something about his wonderful talent to be able to paint a word picture. And so we're going to walk with Phil now around the Royal Docks, and this comes from part 3 on the other side of the tracks. The regeneration of the Royal Docks makes a good case study. As you come out of the crystal exhibition, your gaze is inevitably drawn to the anonymous hangar-like structures that line the dock on one side, and on the other to the long-abandoned Millennium Mills, once upon a time the home of the white loaf, that staple in the manual working-class diet, now scheduled to be the hub of a new business and commercial district. And to the Tate & Lyle sugar refinery at Silvertown, the last of the smokestack industries that once dominated the landscape. Overhead, cable cars circle in eerie silence, bringing pilgrims from the O2 and the Greenwich Peninsula to sample this surreal mix of urban past and future. En route, they may well marvel at the stupendous aerial views of riverine London, perhaps lulled by the reassuring commentary, so that this affordance of the bomber's eye view no longer evokes the shock and awe of the Blitz, that founding moment in the slow but steady destruction of East London as a working-class city, a moment only briefly evoked by two spectacular fires at Millennium Mills in recent years. Perhaps it's not surprising that EastEnders of an older generation, when trying to describe their sense of shock at the transformation of the St Catherine's Docks, Stratford or the Royals, spontaneously draw on the language of the Blitz. One ex-docker told me that visiting Stratford in the run-up to the Olympics was like seeing the area devastated by a capitalist bomb. Any such reflections are likely to be rudely interrupted by the roar of a plane taking off from nearby London City Airport, the first and still the most important feature in the local regeneration economy. Residents who have the misfortune to live in the social housing surrounding the airport have been subjected to industrial levels of noise and chemical pollution for over a generation, a lethal form of environmental degradation that can be precisely measured but is largely invisible, unlike the toxic fog that used to blanket the docks. Those who live on the council estates of North Woolwich, historically the most deprived and neglected in the whole of Newham, may well wonder what the attraction is for the students and the young professionals who have come to occupy the new blocks of private flats that have been built in the area over the last 20 years. Well, the simple answer is, of course, that this accommodation is still affordable to those on middle incomes, driven out of the inner East End by rising rents and house prices. Yet that's only half the story. It's the raw edginess of this part of London, its natural symbolism of marginality, so lovingly recreated in the writings of Ian Sinclair, which has made it so inhabitable by would-be urban pioneers, with their disavowed mission of pushing the boundaries of culture ever further east, ever more downriver, into ever more exotic and unknown territory. In the Royal Docks, we can clearly see the two faces of hysterical materialism at work. Firstly, the creation of abstract logistical space, by and for capital, in which the work of construction, maintenance and occupation leaves little or no human mark on the landscape. The giant sheds that house the Newham Council and the Excel Centre are extreme examples of this hyper-modernist urbanism. Secondly, the invention of place that brings dead labour back to a surrogate life in the form of heritage sites, objects of industrial archaeology and public artworks designed to create a symbolic aura to fill the material void. The Line Art Trail, with its non-site specific works by well-known artists, is a case in point. So is the replacement of the Railway Heritage Museum at North Woolwich by yet another art centre. Well, fortunately, that's not the whole story. The People's Plan for the Royal Docks, published in 1981 by a group of local trade unionists and community activists, outlined a strategy of economic regeneration around developing the existing skills base of the area, with boat building and repair, high-tech maritime industry, plus a floating maritime heritage museum, water sports centres and social housing around the dock. The plan continues to be an inspiration for many of those now campaigning for a working waterfront against property developers who want to replace the remaining industrial estates along the Thames with luxury apartment blocks. In the Royal Docks itself, long-term residents and school children have combined with the help of staff from the UEL, Royal Docks campus, to create an audio trail, Ports of Call, which tells the area's backstory, but also brings it up to date. A recent resident has made a marvellous map showing the ecology of the Royal Docks, documenting all the vegetation and trees that have managed to withstand and adapt to the high levels of pollution around London City Airport, a potent metaphor of sustainable resistance. And a group of staff and students from the Development Planning Unit at UCL have produced a new design strategy for the docks, which gives priority to the needs of existing communities. Meanwhile, as graffiti sprouts along the Docklands Light Railway and Crossrail routes that slice through the area, severing many potential social links, a group of walking artists are creating an alternative narrative trail through the area, reconnecting its past, present and future. And in one of the most significant recent developments, a group of young artists in Silvertown, unable to find affordable places to live and work, have occupied the Tate Institute, a building originally donated to the council as a social club for local workers and residents. Their plan, to turn it into a craft centre for use by school children and residents groups, gained considerable local support, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that the council applied to evict them. An alliance has thus sprung up between these new EastEnders and members of the long-established Dockland community.
The commuting between the two in such a way as to never lose sight of how the one needed to be related to the other. Then there was the generosity of spirit, which applied sociological imagination in such a way as to ensure that the object of study was never just an object, but was always recognised as at one and the same time a subject, subjects in their own right, just as much as the researcher. And then that note of furious impatience, a kind of furiosity, as well as a joy in the world, a furious impatience with it. And in my book, Phil configured these stylistic traits in such a way as to offer us social critique, which is at the same time a very powerful and sometimes poetic form of modernist writing, which has a lot of musicality in it, and in some ways is closer to John Coltrane than some sort of dry statistical analysis. But we all know, don't we, that sometimes that configuration didn't come together, and sometimes the furiosity became not so much expressed in the writing, but became more like a personal animosity, an animosity against the person, against Phil himself, an animosity that was both self-destructive and self-expansive. And I think in those moments, which I have only ever experienced a very diluted version of myself, but in those moments, I think the comparison is not so much with John Coltrane, maybe more like Ornette Coleman or Johnny Cash. So I'd like to conclude my contribution with a few lines that don't, but they might have come from not the man in the black, but the man coming out of a black dog with a rueful, wistful sense of how life might have been easier without that, but also recognising that without any of the notes of fury, the work and the writing would simply not have been the same. And I think I've got permission to do this. I think I'm on dodgy ground, but I think I've got permission to do this from Phil himself, because I do remember one time in the run-up to London 2012, how annoyed I was that he concluded a serious seminar with a poem that he'd written for the occasion. And in my sort of, I thought, newly disciplined mode of thinking, such things shouldn't be allowed. And then I realised, it took me a while, but I realised there was a lot more truth in the poem than in many of the seminar papers. So yeah. I wish I were a different man who'd lived his life quite differently, who knows it's true and feels it too, that love's supreme and God made you. I'd sue for peace and harmony, and yet I'm wired as God made me. So this is Phil's last wiring that we know of. Don't go home without one.
I don't think I've ever used a microphone before. Just see. Hope you can hear me. Yes. Well, I actually chose.
Bit
Well, I think
closer, bit closer.
closer. Okay. I think I chose the most difficult of the chapters. It was the before last one, the 5th chapter, part 1, which is about psychoanalysis and racism. I think it reminded me in a way of reading some of Phil's writing, not so long after we met, and having been reduced to tears because I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand the thought, and the sentence structure was just as complex as the thought. Phil agreed that he should write more simply, but he also defended himself by saying that some things just are complicated. In this essay, he rejects a reductionist view of racism, saying it's not just this, it's not just that, and it's not. And then I thought of Bertolt Brecht, because he had these lovely, witty two-liners. Any fool can understand this. But Phil didn't agree, and so he wrote 50 pages to explain why. And this is him talking now. The payoff for adding a properly psychoanalytic dimension is that instead of simply demonstrating the illogicality of racist beliefs, a relatively easy task, whose accomplishment may make us feel useful as intellectuals, it does little to tackle the underlying problem. In this essay, I look at how these beliefs are underpinned by certain indicative structures of desire and its disavowal. It may then become possible to pinpoint hitherto unrecognized sources of undercover resistance to anti-racist policies and to devise more effective ways of engaging with them. In this way, anti-racist work may be able to tackle some of the more intractable forms of popular and institutional racism that left anti-racism, with its overwhelming attachment to rationalist and prescriptive modes, has so far failed to do. He then proceeds to cover an exhausting list of psychoanalytic approaches since Freud, in which he finds each one more or less up to the task he had set. We have to wait, though, until the second part of this section number 5, chapter 5, to hear briefly how he himself tried to apply this approach to anti-racist work. He talked about his work with youngsters and a collaboration at times with Stuart Hall. And he tells of his work, us of his work with traditional characters such as Anansi, the trickster, who he pits against Spider-Woman, to get children to talk about feelings of power, knowledge, colonial legacy, hoping to expose deeper, more unconscious reaches of the racist imagination. By the way, the clarity of Phil's writing did improve. And I think you will enjoy this last chapter with its ramble through the various schools and movements, and we'll try and guess where his preference will lie. But it is complicated, and I did have to read it twice, and at times more than twice. For me, his attitude to life, and above all his writing, was always about walking this tightrope between apparently irreconcilable attitudes. His politics was not one-dimensional, but a dynamic middle stance that sees beyond the impasse. And this always gave me courage and optimism. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. It's been fantastic. Really, really good.
Dervla here has the cashless machine with which you can buy the book. So drink more than you meant to, please.